to go ahead and get started. We are on our final week of our yearly series where we take the 4 weeks leading up to Advent to talk about saints of the church. And today is a really fun one. Somewhat new to me. I've been studying her all week, and I hope you like her. She's cool. Francesca Cabrini was born July 1850 on a farm nestled on the soft farmland outside Milan, Italy, the youngest of 13 children in a world, with no guarantees. She arrived 2 months premature, which would set off alarm bells even today, but in the mid-19th century, it was thought a miracle that she even lived. But little Francesca came out fighting, lungs too small for the job, but so determined to live. And you can almost already hear the temptation to mythologize, which would not be entirely wrong. This little girl, just so tiny and frail, had an almost ethereal presence, the sort of child that made even the adults around her lower their voices without even really knowing why. Her family was devout in the old Italian way. Faith just baked into their daily bread. But faith could not protect her from the realities of the century in which she had been born. By the time she was 10 years old, they had buried 3 of her siblings. Only 4 of the 13 Cabrini children would live to adulthood. Both her parents died the year she turned 20. A year later, smallpox swept through her village like an invisible scythe, just cutting down neighbors. Francesca caught it too, the fever, the rash, the dread that your own skin had become the enemy. She somehow survived and couldn't help thinking there had to be some reason for this. Her childhood was a kind of apprenticeship in loss that began to form her. Not a hardness exactly, but with a peculiar stubborn resilience. This quiet inner conviction that life wasn't something that was just happening to her. It was something she intended to shape. As a little girl, she was often sick, and her father would hold her in his lap by their big fireplace and read tales from the annals of the propagation of the faith. They were missionary tales, tales of adventure, sharing the love of God in far-off places, especially China. And this captivated Francesca's imagination. The Cabrini children often visited their uncle, Don Luigi Oldini, who was an old parish priest. It's a great name, right? Whose generosity had kind of long since been detached from common sense. In fact, it was said by the people, they joked if you complimented his shoes, you'd end up walking home in them, socks and all. He was just this generous old soul, and he lived beside a canal, and Francesca loved to sit by the swiftly moving water with scrap paper and a basket of violets, folding flimsy paper boats and loading each boat with a single violet, sending them downstream and calling them her missionaries, sent on blind faith that they'd end up somewhere where they were needed. It's just sort of the kind of act of senseless beauty that sort of just makes you ache a little bit. One day she leaned too far over the water and slipped, startled, and fell over the edge. The current grabbed her and water folded over her like a curtain. She couldn't swim, but she fought until the world went dark. She awakened on the shore, coughing, sputtering, and terrified, her uncle trying to rouse her, asking her who had pulled her out, but she had no idea. Nobody ever knew. The near drowning, though, left a permanent mark on her life. By the next day, she was in bed with a serious infection. Her already fragile lungs never forgave the time spent underwater. She would carry that moment with her for the rest of her life in the form of a persistent wheezing cough and frequent bouts of sickness, and also a traumatic phobia of water that never left her. Yet these weaknesses seem to sharpen her resolve, as well as her keen awareness that just breath itself is a precious gift from God. In tracing really the beginnings of Francesca Cabrini's incredible life, we have to start here with the waters that nearly drown her that then scared her to death, these waters would one day carry her to the life she couldn't even imagine. God's grace, she would learn, had this habit of just sort of bubbling up from the very places that try to pull us under. And Francesca spent her life sending little offerings downstream, trusting the current of God's grace to deliver a message of love and care. Her intelligence announced itself early. It's kind of like the girl who's a foot taller than everybody else in the class, you know? She just kind of stuck out. She was just so smart and feisty. And you could pretend not to notice, but there it was. And she must have sensed this about herself, the sharpness of her mind, the ache of ambition always catching in her throat, pounding at her ribs like a second heartbeat. But in 1850s Italy, a woman's path was plotted far in advance, almost like a train schedule. Fathers made their early choices, then handed them off to husbands who made all their decisions for them. And if a woman had real firepower, you know what I mean, real voltage, what was she to do in a world like that? This was always going to be her dilemma. At the time, one of the only divergent moves involved joining Catholic orders. Those mysterious, cloistered, rule-bound communities were one of the only spaces in their world where a woman could step outside the script, could lead, could study, and travel, make her own choices. And she seems to have kind of figured this out early on, both her own abilities and the freedom the church could offer her, because for as long as anyone could remember, Francesca dressed all of her little dolls like nuns, telling every day she was one day going to be a missionary to China. After the river episode, her big sister Rosa became her tutor, and Rosa was like twice her age. Rosa was harsh and domineering. She saw it as her job to smother Francesca's missionary dreams and taunted her mercilessly at times so bad her mom had to step in. But this only hardened Francesca's determination. Only now she started to kind of keep it to herself, internalizing her resolve. She began to learn self-control, self-possession. Dealing with Rosa taught her to think critically, but to speak strategically. Rosa meant to close the door on her ambitions, but in fact, she flung it wide open, and Francesca began imagining a missionary future, the way almost other girls imagine wedding dresses and bassinets. In fact, she made a private vow at age 11, with a priest even. A little girl's promise, spoken with unnerving seriousness. Her life would belong to God, and for Francesca, there would be no going back. Age 13, she was sent off to boarding school in Arluno with the Daughters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the most Catholic name of a school ever. And she was a good student, kind of the mascot of the place. They loved her. She learned French, Italian, Latin, and theology, but her passion was geography. She spent hours poring over maps and atlases, dreaming of missionary travels. She ended up training as a teacher, but she was so sickly, the nuns thought she wouldn't even be able to sit for the exams. Of course, she did and graduated cum laude, returned home, and took a teaching position at her old parish school where she went. And she never really wanted to teach. That was sort of the irony of it. She was just a natural. Like, she could teach the way some people can just do math or sing. She just had the gift. But still, this dream of a mission to China had hold of her, and she began applying to Catholic orders that might take her there, starting with the Daughters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, where the women who had educated her and loved and doted on her, and yet when she applied, they turned her down. Too sickly, they said, too frail for this kind of life. This was a devastating blow to her. She kept teaching, and this local parish priest, Father Don Antonio Cerati, unlike the nuns, he could see through all the wheezing and coughing to her strength and resolve. And he started to believe in her. He really valued her mind, her maturity, and he could see this strange gift she had for inspiring people around her. And so when she began applying to other religious orders, he would quietly run around and discourage them from accepting her, which sounds villainous. Until you learn his true motivation, which was he was about to get promoted to a much higher position, which would he could open a lot of doors for Francesca. And immediately after that move, he tapped her to take this important job. It turned out to be a total disaster, reforming an orphanage called the House of Providence. The place was ruled by a woman named Antonia Tondini, who had bought the position with family money. And she ruled this place like a tyrant, was unstable, given to fits of rage, and what ended up, they didn't know at the time, was stealing funds to siphon them off to one of a wayward nephew. And Francesca, when he said, "This is what I want you to do," she reminded him, "I want to be a missionary." She tried to get out of it. He insisted, and she protested, and he insisted to more, and she kept protesting, and this is how it went with him. And finally, he ordered her to go to the orphanage, and she said, "Okay, I'll go." Still only age 24, only a novice as a nun, Francesca just walked into a hurricane. Tondini was over 40, abusive to the staff, neglectful of the orphans, and somehow, she said, both volatile and bored at the same time. But an orphanage is in large part a school, and she knew how to run a school, so she just started there with simple reforms. And the immediate backlash from Tondini was volcanic. Pretty soon, the verbal abuse turned to physical attacks. But the reforms started working, and the place sort of came to life. And at the end of her little 3-year stint there, Francesca took her formal vows as a nun. And then after that, something broke, and everything just blew up. Tondini abandoned all pretense of Christianity. She stopped going to Mass and confession. She hatched this plan to close the orphanage and give all the money to her nephew. And when it was blocked, she took the bishop to civil court. He ends up excommunicating her, and they're fighting, and finally he just gives up and lets her have the orphanage, or lets her have the real estate, but he has to close the orphanage, leaving Francesca and the other nuns with nothing to do. And so the bishop called her in and said, "Look, I know you want to be a missionary. Why don't you just found a missionary order yourself?" And for the first time in Francesca's life, she was speechless. But she gathered herself, took a breath, looked him in the eye, and said, "I will look for a house." And thus began the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart. Before we continue, I think it's worth noticing one of the features of Catholic religious orders, which is obedience. And, as Americans, we have an allergy to too much authority. But in religious orders, they vow obedience to a superior, which sounds like the prelude to a hostage situation, But for them, obedience was almost like apprenticeship. The superior's job was to get to know them, to spot their gifts, and then to steer them to places where those gifts could really catch fire. And if you think about it, if Francesca had not obeyed Father Cerati, there would be no Saint Cabrini. And this is a pattern that would repeat for her. She would submit to a leader, they'd watch her work, but before long, they'd be expanding her reach and helping her chase whatever impossible dreams she had cooked up. She inspired this deep loyalty in her superiors. She would poke and prod and bother them into taking huge risks, but helped them to discover that they could be the sort of men who backed world-changing projects. And they all loved her for it. In this case, her superiors thought they had merely authorized the creation of a modest local mission. Francesca believed that they had just launched a global missionary order. And she warned the bishop, she's really famous for having said this, "Don't think my institute can be confined to one city or diocese. The whole world is not wide enough for me," she said. And he laughed with her, but you get the feeling he kind of sat up a little straighter after that. And with Father Cerati as her mentor, they began putting together the money for a house in Codogno and some furniture, the beginnings of an orphanage, and they were living just hand to mouth. In fact, they were begging for money on the streets just to keep things going. But over the next 5 years, they opened an orphanage and a school and a nursery, and then very soon after that began expanding eventually to 7 cities all over Lombardy, including one in Milan, an important city. And it was then that Francesca turned her attention toward Rome. She had this feeling that any like global missionary order would have to launch from Rome, but first she'd have to get there, open a house there. And of course she went to her local bishops, and they said, no, like slow down. They said, just be patient. So of course she immediately traveled to Rome and went straight to the cardinal from Lombardy, Cardinal Lucido Parocchi, and she asked him to let her open a house in the city. And he said, no, your order's too young. You only have 145 sisters. Rome can't just indulge every foundress with a dream. And she pushed back, and he stonewalled, and she argued, and he undercut, and she insisted, and he raised more doubts and objections. And you get the feeling in the story about this that the more she protested, the more fun this guy was having, like somebody actually with the guts to push back. Finally said, okay, if you raise 500,000 lira, you can start a house in Rome. And they both knew this was not going to happen. But Parocchi just admired her fight and boldness. And a year later, she was back in his office asking. He was saying no again, which is when Francesca delivered a zinger that maybe only she could get away with. It was a ramp up. And she said, is this you talking, or is this the Pope? And he said later that he gasped audibly, like he was her superior. And so she just politely suggested, with disarming innocence, that he might want to consult His Holiness. And while Parocchi mulled this over, Francesca rallied every civic and religious leader in the Lombardy region to fire off letters to the Pope, singing her praises. So by the time Parocchi got his audience with Pope Leo XIII, His Holiness was already a huge fan of Francesca Cabrini. 2 weeks later, the cardinal summoned Francesca, and their friendship was kind of in full bloom by this time, and he decided to mess with her a little bit. He said, are you ready to obey my decision, no matter what? He asked her, and she said, yes, I am. And he said, good, then I do not allow you to establish a house in Rome. And he washed her face, like no reaction. Instead, he said, I order you to found 2 houses in Rome. And she took the joke pretty well and immediately agreed. She would build 2 houses in Rome and 2 schools there as well. And once again, her obedience had opened a door that strategy could not. Her sisters immediately went to work, and within a few years, they had laid the foundation for this work. And Cardinal Parocchi became just a fierce ally. He celebrated her intrepid spirit. This diminutive woman, very short, frequently ill, wheezing and coughing her way through life. She could outwork any man in his orbit. And still this old dream of China smoldered. And finally, with Parocchi's help, she secured an audience with Pope Leo XIII. It's funny, in their first meeting, she didn't even mention China. It was like she was just trying to befriend him. And Leo immediately warmed her. I mean, how could you not? She was just such a spitfire. Eventually, she confided her hopes in him and asked for permission to go to China. And he thought about it for quite some time and then called her back, affirmed her calling as a missionary leader, and then redirected her whole life in one sentence. He said, not to the east, but to the west. New York City would be her destination. But at last, she was a missionary. In March of 1889, Cabrini and 6 sisters boarded a ship called the Borgogna for New York City. Hopeful and exhausted, carrying the weight of a decade-long struggle, they traveled in steerage with all the immigrants, seasick, cramped, exhausted. Her journal said the lodgings were no better than a stable. But for Mother Cabrini, the biggest challenge was the rough seas that suddenly triggered her phobia of water. It was a rough journey. Halfway through, they hit this dangerous storm. I mean, this ship, I don't know, man. Like, that does not seem super stable to me. And it was a big storm. They were in, like, legit peril for a few hours. The sisters passed the time below deck tending to motion-sick passengers. They made it through, and after 12 days, they finally saw Manhattan rising through the fog. A man named Father Morelli, parish priest from the Five Points area, the roughest corner of the city, met them at the docks, walked them to the rectory for a hot meal, but Mother Cabrini could tell he was nervous, and after some prodding, he confessed, nothing is ready for you guys. No convent, no orphanage, no school, no plan. In fact, they spent the first night, these 6 nuns, in a 5 Points brothel with moldy mattresses and blankets crawling with bed bugs. It was so bad they slept the night sitting in chairs and leaning on tables, listening to rats scurrying around the floor. Francesca, though, she didn't sleep at all. She had this feeling something was off. The next morning, she had this big meeting with the Archbishop, Bishop Corrigan, an Irishman from Newark. He was known as Smiling Mickey. He ran the church in New York City. But he was not smiling. He was awkward and cool. And he apologized and said, look, I'm sorry, I've written to Rome asking them to delay your journey. The school plan for you guys has closed. There's no money. There's no housing. He said, I'll buy your return tickets. You need to get on the next boat and head back home. Mother Cabrini said, no. It's like that guy from the family. No, we're here, and we're staying. And Corrigan was kind of taken aback by this. He's like, you don't understand. You're in my charge. I'm telling you to go home. And she corrected him with politeness, just sharp as steel, saying, I think you're mistaken. I am under the authority of the Holy Father. And then she opened a bag and produced a stack of letters from the Pope and like half of the Vatican Curia. And Corrigan was like, oh man, I am outmatched here. Cabrini wasn't going anywhere. What she didn't know is she had arrived in the middle of a huge fight and tensions within the immigrant community, especially among the Italians. You know, from 1889 to 1910, about 20 years, 2 million Italians poured into America. More despised than any other immigrant group, poor, illiterate, unable to speak English. The Italians were scapegoats for every social ill in the city. They worked the most dangerous jobs for starvation wages. They packed into airless tenements, endured abuses that nobody even tried to hide anymore. And to make things worse, they had all but abandoned, felt all but abandoned by the Catholic Church. You know, in Italy, where they came from, there was one priest for every few hundred people. In New York, there were 19 Italian priests for 250,000 Italians. You couldn't find someone to do weddings and funerals and first communions. And eventually, people just sort of gave up on the church and drifted into bitterness. Archbishop Corrigan was an Irishman. So he was part of an earlier wave of immigrants who had clawed for every inch of power they held. The Irish and Germans were entrenched and organized and well-financed. But Corrigan felt deep sympathy for the Italians. In fact, he had been petitioning Rome to send help. He had been personally lobbying Mother Cabrini to come to America. But now he was under all this pressure not to surrender any institutional turf. And by the time she arrived, he was conflicted, he was unprepared, and annoyed with himself and impatient with her. And then their first encounter didn't help. He kept cautioning her to move slowly, but Francesca was all gas and no brakes. Man, she just pushing limits, never asking him for permission. This frail, coughing, wheezing waif hit New York City like a velvet hammer. And she had also trained her, you know, she's a teacher. She had trained her sisters so very well, building this quiet, unassuming bunch of just crazy women who wouldn't take no for an answer. Just, extremely effective at their job. So with her soft voice and her pleasant smile, she would distract you while her sisters would quietly rearrange all your things, And as Corrigan just dithered, Francesca just went to town. She convinced this wealthy Italian heiress or countess to donate property for an orphanage pretty far uptown. And Corrigan was horrified. Like little brown-skinned, dark-haired, brown-eyed Italian orphans running around uptown, it would be a disaster. Plus the upkeep would be too expensive. But Mother Cabrini had what most of the men around her seemed to lack: courage. She could act decisively in the face of danger and fear. And her whole life was just this string of barriers broken by sheer force of will and conviction. Courage, she once wrote. God does not give us tasks that cannot be accomplished. Francesca believed it, and she could make others believe it too. And so slowly she worked her magic on Corrigan, proving herself, inspiring his confidence. While her sisters ran the orphanage, she hit the streets and just begged for money to support homeless Italian children. She cultivated a ton of new wealthy Italian donors, ended up opening a new, not just the orphanage, but a school. And pretty soon, her just calm determination won Corrigan over, and they became close friends and allies. Started running interference for her, raising money and support. And before long, they were doing great things for a bunch of Italian immigrants that nobody else wanted to take responsibility for. Meanwhile, her sisters were outgrowing their facilities. And so Corrigan started poking around. He heard about some Jesuits up in the Catskills who had this sprawling seminary, and there's a bunch of land, a couple of big houses. It was everything she would need, except for one tiny thing: there was no water at this place. Their well had run dry. So Corrigan knew they could get the place for a bargain, dirt cheap. And he also knew if anybody could work a miracle with water, it was probably Mother Cabrini. So they closed the deal, and the first well she dug struck water. And so they transformed this West Park facility into clearly their most valuable property. Around that same time, Columbus Hospital was, it's the only place in New York that would take Italians. And it was failing under debt and filth and mismanagement. And on the verge of collapse, they invited Mother Cabrini to come take a tour. She took one look at the mess and said simply, "We're staying." And she took over the facility that day. She would later call this work a war between mold and sewage. Yeah, she was tough. The first night, they found all the mattresses crawling with bed bugs, and they dragged them all into the street, scrubbed every inch of the place. They slept only a couple hours on wooden boards, and at dawn, new patients began arriving. It's no soft launch for her projects. Almost everything she did started in crisis mode. Soon she had rallied a bunch of wealthy Italian-American donors, raised a bunch of funds, and she reincorporated Columbus Hospital in 1892, moved it to a much better, bigger location, more than 100 beds. And so when medical care, which was mostly reserved for the wealthy, was in need, Columbus Hospital would treat anyone, including Italian immigrants. And this became a symbol for the whole city. These Italian immigrants matter. They matter to God, and they matter to us. Once again, this frail, determined woman took on the impossible, despite her constant, physical health problems. She once wrote, "We can serve our weakness, or we can serve our purpose." That's how she looked at it. And for her, her purpose, her work, ended up becoming the gospel. Not in sermons, but in blood and skin, in broken bones set right by able hands, in orphans who for the rest of their life had a mother, Mother Cabrini. Her life became good news to the poor. The sisters who knew her say they often heard Mother Cabrini murmuring almost like a mantra under her breath, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You know this verse? Philippians 4:13. It's well known. I confess I've grown a mild allergy to this verse. You hear it in post-game interviews with pro athletes, or plastered on megachurch building campaigns as if Paul really meant go forth and crush your rivals, like win big for Jesus. Like God has a preference for all things bigger, better, higher, stronger, faster. Trouble is, this is almost exactly the opposite of what Paul is saying. In a prison cell in Rome, chained to a guard 24/7, Paul got a letter from some friends in Philippi. Philippians is his letter back telling them not to worry. And in the section leading up to this verse, we heard it before, Paul pleads with them to live at peace with one another, to rejoice, to be gentle. He gives thanks for their concern and faithfulness, and then he drops this all-timer. He says, "For I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles." It's a little different in context, doesn't it? Paul's all things through Christ isn't about winning or succeeding or conquering or achieving. It's about enduring hardship, suffering, and instability. Things that make you question whether God's paying any attention at all. He's saying, whether life is overflowing with joy or it's run bone dry, Christ gives me the strength to bear it. So when Mother Cabrini spent her days whispering, "I can do all things through Christ," she wasn't like psyching herself up for greatness. This wasn't a dream board on The Secret or whatever. She was drawing breath, literally, spiritually, to endure the hardships her calling required. And she could at times seem very ambitious and aggressive and persistent, but only on behalf of the marginalized and the poor, just like Jesus. She did not long to conquer. She longed to love, to live in solidarity with the least, last, and lowly. Her ambitions were for them, for their peace and flourishing. Her spirituality was simple. This is unique to her. I've never heard this before. She said all she did is picture herself filling in for the disciples who fell asleep with Jesus in the garden. She said, what I try to do is stay awake in their place, share his sorrows in the moment as he means to liberate those who suffer. She said, I just imagine myself saying, "I'm awake with you, Jesus. As you give your life away for the world, teach me how to help, how to see the world as you do." And despite all her work, she spent 4, 5, 6 hours a day in prayer. Soon her work stretched beyond New York, first to New Orleans, a school and an orphanage, then to Chicago, another school and orphanage, and another hospital. She eventually moved to Chicago, and that's where she became a naturalized U.S. citizen. She went to Denver, found a school for immigrant minors and children, then Seattle, L.A., Philadelphia, Scranton, each city another fire she walked into. And the letters kept coming. Cities, mayors, bishops, foreign countries begging for help. And she sent her sisters where the need was most profound, opening orphanages, schools, and hospitals in Italy, France, Spain, Nicaragua, Brazil, Argentina, and Panama. Despite her fragile health and crippling fear of water, Francesca Cabrini crossed the Atlantic Ocean almost 30 times in her lifetime. When she died in 1917, age 67, she was leading, chokes me up. She was leading more than 1,500 nuns. They had built almost 70 institutions like this in 8 countries. And just a few years after her death, they even pushed into China, finally, her lifelong dream. What strikes me about her life is that it never seemed to unfold according to a plan. It's like she didn't say, this is the work I want to do, so much as she said, this is the work that needs to be done. She dreamed of China. God sent her to America. She longed to be an evangelist, but people need food and shelter, so she worked on that. They needed education. She built schools. They needed healthcare. She bought hospitals. They needed justice. She organized political power and allies in government. And just through charm and persistence and force of will and grit, she built one of the largest charitable networks in the world, all of it run by women. 30 years after her death, Mother Francesca Cabrini was officially canonized as Saint Francesca Xavier Cabrini. On the day of her elevation, every city in the world where her sisters had a mission held this huge celebration in her honor. In Chicago, where it was kind of her adopted hometown, the crowds were so large, they had to hold the service at Soldier Field. This is a picture of it, where the Bears play. Stunning. Mother Cabrini was actually the very first American to be recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church, which seems significant given the fact that she was an immigrant. And in 1950, the Catholic Church declared her the patron saint of immigrants. And they could not have made a better choice. So, I commend to you today, Redemption Church, Saint Francesca Cabrini. May her memory be a blessing. Let's pray. Oh God, I'm so glad to have met this crazy person, this powerful saint. And I think her passion and courage has a lot to teach us and inform us, ways to shape our imagination for how we can live in solidarity with the immigrant. And I thank you that you've called Redemption Church to this neighborhood and to a city of immigrants. And I pray, God, that we would follow her example and be bold and dauntless, that we would not try to save the world, but we would try to love the world. And we celebrate her life today and give you thanks for it. Amen.